The wind tore through the pines like a blade, and Clara Whitfield could no longer feel her fingers. She had been walking for 6 hours through the worst storm Blackthorn Ridge had seen in a decade, and every step now felt like a gamble against her own body. Snow whipped sideways, stinging her cheeks, and the trail she had memorized just that morning had vanished beneath a foot of fresh powder. She was not supposed to be out here alone. She was not supposed to be out here at all. But the radio in her cabin had gone dead 3 days ago. Her truck had slid off the icy service road the night before, and the only choice left was to walk toward the ranger station at Ravenswood Pass before the cold finished what the storm had started. Clara pressed her gloved hand against a boulder to steady herself and looked up at a sky the color of ash. She was 29 years old, a wildlife researcher who had spent the last 2 winters cataloging elk migration patterns in this remote stretch of mountains. She loved the isolation, the silence, the way the forest seemed to hold its breath before a storm. But right now, that same silence felt like a warning. Her backpack, once heavy with supplies, now held only a half-empty bottle of water, a folded map gone soft with damp, and a single foil packet of dried meat and berries she had been rationing for 2 days. She had told herself she would eat it only when there was truly nothing left. That moment was closing in fast. She pushed forward, boots sinking into snow up to her shins, breath fogging in ragged bursts. Somewhere behind the wind, she thought she heard something else. A sound too soft to be the storm, too sharp to be a branch cracking. She stopped, listening. Nothing. Just wind and the groan of old trees bending under the weight of ice. She told herself it was nothing, and kept moving, but her heart had already begun to beat a little faster. The light was fading when she reached the edge of a narrow ravine she did not recognize. Her stomach dropped. She had misjudged the trail, veered too far west in the whiteout, and now stood at the lip of unfamiliar terrain with darkness only an hour away. Panic pressed at the edges of her mind, but she forced it down the way she had trained herself to do in the field. Panic wasted energy. Energy was the only thing keeping her alive. She scanned the ravine for shelter and spotted a shallow overhang of rock about 30 feet below, half hidden by a fallen spruce. It was not much, but it would cut the wind. She began the careful climb down, gripping exposed roots and jagged stone, her muscles trembling with fatigue and cold. When her boots finally touched the flat ground beneath the overhang, she allowed herself one long breath of relief. That was when she heard it again. Not wind, not branches. A small, thin whimper, high and broken, coming from somewhere close. Clara froze, every instinct in her body sharpening at once. She had spent enough years in the wild to know the difference between imagination and reality, and this was real. She crouched low, moving toward the sound with slow, deliberate steps, her breath held tight in her chest. Behind a cluster of snow-covered roots, tucked into a hollow beneath the fallen spruce, she saw them. 3 small shapes, pressed together in a trembling heap of gray and brown fur. Wolf pups. They could not have been more than a few weeks old, their eyes barely open, their small bodies shivering violently against the cold. There was no mother in sight, no den entrance nearby that she could see. Just 3 abandoned pups, alone in a ravine, in the middle of one of the worst storms this mountain had thrown in years. Clara's first instinct was caution. She had studied wolves long enough to know that a mother would not be far from her young, and an adult wolf defending pups could turn deadly in seconds. She scanned the shadows around her, searching for movement, for eyes reflecting what little light remained. She saw nothing. No tracks leading in or out, except the faint impressions the pups themselves had made, half buried by fresh snow. Whatever had happened to their mother, it seemed she was not coming back tonight. The pups noticed her a moment later, and the smallest one let out a cry so weak and desperate that something inside Clara's chest twisted painfully. She knew the rules. She had taught them to visiting students a dozen times. Do not interfere with wildlife. Let nature take its course, even when it is cruel. But there was a difference between rules learned in a classroom and the reality of 3 dying pups shaking in the snow while a storm howled overhead. She knelt down slowly, keeping her movements small and unthreatening. The pups pressed closer together, but they did not run. They could not run. They were too weak, too cold, too far gone into exhaustion to do anything but shiver and stare at her with cloudy, half-formed eyes. Clara's mind raced through the possibilities. She could walk away and continue toward the ranger station, telling herself this was nature's way. Or she could stay, knowing that staying meant sacrificing precious daylight, precious warmth, and perhaps her only remaining food. She thought of her own hunger, the ache already gnawing at her stomach, the last foil packet resting heavy and precious in her backpack. She thought of the miles still ahead of her before she would find safety and warmth of her own. Then she looked at the pups again, at the way the smallest one had begun to lower its head, its trembling slowing in a way that Clara recognized with a cold jolt of alarm. Not calming, fading. She did not remember deciding. Her hands were already moving, unzipping her backpack, pulling out the foil packet she had promised herself she would not touch until there was truly nothing left. She told herself this was the last of everything, that after this she would have nothing to give her own body for the final stretch of the journey. But some choices are not made with logic. Some choices are made with something older and quieter, something that does not ask permission from fear. She tore the packet open and laid small pieces of the dried meat in her open palm, holding it low and still in front of the pups. For a long moment, nothing happened. The pups only stared, too weak to trust, too frightened to move. Then the smallest one, the one whose breathing had grown so faint, lifted its head an inch and sniffed the air. Clara held perfectly still, barely breathing herself, watching as the pup dragged itself forward on trembling legs and pressed its small nose against her palm. It took the food gently, almost cautiously, and Clara felt tears sting her eyes, not from the cold this time, but from something far harder to name. The second pup followed moments later, then the third, until all three were huddled close to her hand, eating what little she had left to give. She sat there in the fading light, snow falling steadily around her, feeling the warmth of her own body being pulled away by the storm, and yet she did not move. She watched the pups eat every last piece, watched the way their trembling slowly began to ease, watched the small spark of life return to eyes that had been closing only minutes before. Whatever hunger clawed at her own stomach now felt distant, unimportant, drowned out by the strange and fierce protectiveness rising inside her chest. When the food was gone, the pups did not retreat. Instead, they pressed closer, drawn by the last remaining warmth of her body, and Clara found herself gathering them gently against her jacket, shielding them from the wind with her own frame. She knew this was not wise. She knew every rule of wilderness survival told her to think of herself first, to preserve her own strength, to keep moving towards safety before darkness swallowed the mountain whole. But she also knew that if she left now, these three small lives would not survive the night. She made a decision then, quiet and absolute. She would stay through the worst of the storm, share what warmth she had left, and move at first light, carrying the pups if she had to, toward whatever shelter she could find. She did not yet understand what this decision would cost her, or what it would set in motion. She did not know that somewhere beyond the ridge, unseen in the deepening dark, something enormous had already caught her scent on the wind, and was moving toward the ravine, with slow, deliberate purpose. The temperature continued to drop as full darkness settled over Blackthorn Ridge. Clara pulled her jacket tighter around the pups, tucking them against her chest one by one, feeling their small heartbeats flutter against her own. She had stopped shivering some time ago, which she recognized, somewhere in the back of her exhausted mind, as a warning sign rather than a comfort. Her body was beginning to conserve heat in ways that meant real danger was closing in. She needed a fire. She needed real shelter. She needed to move. But every time she considered shifting position, the pups whimpered in protest, pressing closer, and something in her simply could not bring herself to disturb them. Instead, she reached into her backpack with stiff fingers and found the small emergency fire kit she carried on every trip into the backcountry. Her hands shook so badly that the first two attempts to strike a spark failed completely, the flint scraping uselessly against damp tinder. On the third try, a small ember caught, and Clara cupped her hands around it with the desperate focus of someone protecting the last candle in a dark room. The fire that finally took hold was small, barely enough to warm a few feet of space beneath the rock overhang, but it was enough. She fed it slowly, with dry twigs she had gathered earlier in the day out of habit, a survival instinct so deeply trained into her that she had collected them without even thinking she might need them tonight. The pups stirred at the new warmth, blinking their cloudy eyes open fully for the first time, and Clara found herself smiling despite everything, despite the cold, despite the fear still coiled tight in her stomach. She studied them properly now in the firelight. They were larger than she expected for pups so young, their paws oversized, in a way that suggested they would grow into truly massive animals. Their fur held a pattern she did not immediately recognize. A deep charcoal gray shot through with faint silver markings along the spine, unlike any wolf coloring she had documented in her research notes. She filed the observation away in the analytical part of her mind that never fully switched off, even in crisis, even exhausted and freezing in the dark. It was the silence after the fire settled that unsettled her most. The storm had begun to ease, the wind dropping to a low moan instead of a scream, and in that new quiet, she became aware of a sound she had not noticed before. A low, distant call, rolling across the ridge like a wave. A howl, deep and resonant, far larger in sound than any she had recorded in 2 years of fieldwork. It was answered almost immediately by a second howl from a different direction, then a third, each one closer than the last. Clara's pulse quickened. She had spent enough time studying wolf behavior to know exactly what this meant. A pack was calling to each other, coordinating, searching. And searching, she suspected with a growing knot of fear in her chest, for exactly what she was currently holding against her own body. She looked down at the 3 pups, now calm and drowsy in the firelight, and understood with sudden clarity that she was not simply caring for abandoned animals. She was sitting in the middle of contested territory, holding the missing young of a pack large enough to fill the mountainside with overlapping howls. Whatever had separated these pups from their family, whatever storm or accident had scattered them into this ravine, the rest of the pack was now converging on this exact location, drawn by scent and instinct, and the desperate calls she herself could not hear, but knew must be happening, in whatever language wolves used to speak of loss. She thought about her own vulnerability then, truly considered it for the first time since finding the pups. She was one exhausted, injured, half-frozen human being, alone in a ravine at night, with no weapon beyond a small folding knife, meant for cutting rope, sitting beside 3 pups that an entire wolf pack was actively searching for. If the pack found her, and interpreted her presence as a threat rather than a rescue, there would be very little she could do to defend herself. And yet, strangely, fear was not the only thing she felt. Beneath the fear sat something steadier, something that had grown quietly over the last several hours, as she watched 3 dying pups return slowly to life beneath her hands. She had made her choice already. She would not abandon them now, not even as the howls grew louder, not even as she began to make out the shapes of movement at the edge of her small circle of firelight, dark forms weaving silently between the trees above the ravine, watching, waiting, deciding. The night was far from over, and Clara Whitfield understood, with the clear and terrible focus that comes only in moments of true danger, that the hardest part of this encounter had not yet begun. The shapes at the edge of the firelight did not rush forward. They circled instead, patient and silent, moving between the trees with a grace that made Clara's skin prickle despite the fire's warmth. She counted at least 6 sets of eyes reflecting the low flames, though she suspected there were more hidden, just beyond the reach of the light. She kept her body very still, her arms curled protectively around the 3 pups, who had begun to stir at the sound and scent of their kin drawing near. The smallest pup lifted its head first, letting out a thin, wavering cry that cut through the night air. It was answered instantly by a deep, rolling response from somewhere close, a sound so low it seemed to vibrate through the rock beneath Clara's legs. She felt the pups tense against her, not with fear, but with recognition. Whatever fear lived in her own chest, the pups clearly knew exactly what that sound meant. Clara forced herself to breathe slowly, evenly, the way she had trained herself to do during encounters with large wildlife in the field. Sudden movement invited attack. Calm stillness, more often than not, bought time. She kept her eyes low, avoiding direct contact with the watching shapes, and spoke in a soft, steady voice, more for her own nerves than for any hope the animals would understand her words. "I'm not going to hurt them," she whispered into the darkness. "I just didn't want them to freeze." The words felt foolish even as she said them, yet something in her tone must have carried some meaning, because the circling shapes did not close in. Instead, they seemed to wait, watching her with the same patient calculation she imagined a jury might use to weigh a case before delivering judgment. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The fire burned low, and Clara fed it the last of her dry twigs, aware that once it went out, she would lose the small barrier of light that seemed, for now, to be keeping the pack at a careful distance. She glanced down at the pups nestled against her, their breathing slow and even now, their small bodies finally warm enough to rest without shivering. Whatever came next, she told herself, at least she had given them that much. It was then that the largest shape stepped fully into the firelight. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had studied wolves for years, had measured their tracks, catalogued their weights, documented the largest recorded specimens in 3 different mountain ranges. Nothing in her research had prepared her for the animal now standing before her. He was massive, easily twice the size of any wolf she had ever measured, his shoulders broad and powerful beneath a coat of deep silver-gray fur, streaked with darker charcoal markings that matched, unmistakably, the coloring of the pups curled against her chest. A long scar ran across one side of his muzzle, pale against the darker fur, evidence of some past battle that had clearly not gone in his opponent's favor. His eyes, pale amber and startlingly intelligent, fixed on Clara with an intensity that made every instinct in her body scream to run. She did not run. She could not have moved even if she wanted to, frozen not entirely by fear, but by something closer to awe. This was not simply the largest wolf in the pack. This was, unmistakably, its leader, and every other shape still circling in the shadows had gone utterly silent and still, deferring to his presence, the way soldiers might defer to a commanding officer. The great wolf took a slow step closer, his massive paws silent on the snow, his gaze never leaving Clara's face. She could smell him now, a wild, earthy scent carried on the cold air, and she felt her heart pounding so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. The pups, sensing their father's presence, began to squirm against her, whimpering with what she now understood, with sudden and overwhelming clarity, was pure joy rather than fear. "They're yours," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "I found them alone. I didn't take them from you." The wolf did not react to her words in any way she could measure, yet he paused his advance, tilting his head slightly as though considering something beyond simple threat assessment. His nose lifted, drawing in her scent, and Clara realized with a jolt that he was likely smelling the food she had shared, the same food now warming the small bodies pressed against her chest. Whether that scent meant anything to him, whether wolves possessed any capacity to understand sacrifice or kindness in the way humans did, she had no way of knowing. But something in his posture shifted, the raw tension in his shoulders easing by some small but noticeable degree. Clara made a decision in that moment, one that went against every piece of survival training she had ever received. Slowly, carefully, she loosened her hold on the pups, allowing the smallest one to slip free and stumble on unsteady legs toward its father. The great wolf lowered his massive head, nose brushing gently against his offspring, and the tenderness in that single gesture, from an animal capable of such obvious power and danger, struck Clara with unexpected force. One by one, she released the other 2 pups, watching them tumble across the snow toward their father, tails wagging weakly, voices raised in small cries of relief. The wolf nuzzled each of them in turn, his massive frame curling protectively around their smaller bodies, and for a moment, Clara almost forgot the danger of her own position entirely, caught up in the simple, undeniable beauty of a family reunited. Then his eyes lifted back to hers, and the reminder of her own vulnerability returned in full force. She remained kneeling by the dying fire, hands empty now, body exposed and unprotected, watching the largest and most dangerous predator she had ever encountered study her with unreadable amber eyes. The other members of the pack had begun to emerge fully from the shadows, drawn by the reunion, their attention shifting now toward the strange human, who had somehow returned their lost young unharmed. Clara understood, with the sharp clarity that comes only at the edge of true danger, that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether she survived this night at all. The great wolf did not move for a long moment, his amber eyes studying Clara with an intensity that made the cold night air feel even sharper against her skin. The rest of the pack had spread into a loose half-circle around the fading fire, their attention split between the returned pups and the motionless woman who had somehow ended up at the center of their reunion. Clara kept her hands open and visible at her sides, resisting every urge to reach for her small folding knife, knowing that any sudden movement now could be read as a challenge she had no hope of winning. The 3 pups, oblivious to the tension crackling through the clearing, tumbled happily around their father's legs, occasionally glancing back toward Clara with the same trusting curiosity they had shown when she first found them. It was this behavior, she realized later, that likely saved her life. The pups showed no fear of her, no instinct to flee, only the easy comfort of creatures who had already decided she posed no threat. Wolves were highly social animals, deeply attuned to the emotional signals of their pack, and the trust radiating from 3 small bodies was not something even the most powerful alpha could easily dismiss. The great wolf took another step forward, close enough now that Clara could see the individual scars crossing his muzzle, the slight cloudiness in one eye that suggested some old injury, the sheer physical power coiled beneath his thick winter coat. She held her breath as he lowered his head and sniffed the air near her outstretched hands, the same hands that had held the food his pups had eaten only hours before. His nose brushed close enough that she could feel warm breath against her frozen fingers, and every muscle in her body strained against the urge to pull away. He did not bite, he did not growl. Instead, after a long, suspended moment, he exhaled a low breath through his nose and stepped back, his posture shifting from coiled tension into something Clara could only interpret as cautious acceptance. Around the clearing, the other pack members seemed to take their cue from him, their raised hackles lowering, their sharp attention softening into simple watchfulness. Clara allowed herself to breathe again, though she did not dare relax completely. She understood on some fundamental level that she had just witnessed something extraordinarily rare, a wild alpha making a judgment call that went against every instinct that should have told him to eliminate a potential threat near his young. Whether it was the scent of shared food, the visible health and safety of his returned pups, or some other signal she could not begin to interpret, the great wolf had decided, at least for now, that she was not an enemy. The fire had burned down to little more than glowing embers, and Clara knew she could not simply remain in this clearing indefinitely. The cold was already creeping back into her limbs, and true shelter still waited somewhere beyond the ridge. She moved with slow deliberation, gathering her nearly empty backpack, aware of a dozen watchful eyes tracking her every motion. The wolf pack did not scatter as she rose to her feet, though several members shifted uneasily at the change in her posture. She looked toward the great wolf one final time before turning to leave, feeling an odd and unexpected reluctance to walk away from the strange, wordless connection that had passed between them in the firelight. "Take care of them," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the last whispers of wind moving through the ravine. She had no reason to believe the wolf understood a single word, yet something in the way his amber eyes held hers made her wonder, just for a moment, if some deeper understanding had passed between them regardless of language. She began to climb out of the ravine, her muscles screaming in protest after hours of stillness in the cold, her mind already turning toward the long walk still ahead of her before she would reach any kind of safety. She had gone perhaps 20 steps when she heard movement behind her, soft and deliberate against the snow. She turned, heart hammering, expecting to find the pack closing in after all. Instead, she found the great wolf following at a careful distance, his massive frame moving with silent, fluid grace through the drifts, his 3 pups nowhere in sight, likely left in the care of the rest of the pack. He made no move to approach closer, simply matched her pace at a distance of perhaps 30 feet, his amber eyes occasionally flicking toward her, before returning to scan the surrounding darkness. Clara did not know what to make of this development. Every piece of research she had ever conducted suggested wolves avoided unnecessary contact with humans, that an alpha's priority would always be the safety and cohesion of his pack, rather than the well-being of a single stranger stumbling through his territory. And yet here he was, trailing her through the storm-battered forest as though standing guard, his presence somehow both terrifying and, in a way she could not fully articulate, deeply reassuring. She continued walking, her pace slow and careful on the uneven, snow-covered ground, and the great wolf continued to follow, always at that same measured distance, never closing in, never falling back. Twice she stumbled on hidden rocks beneath the snow, and both times she caught herself before falling, aware the entire while of amber eyes watching her every movement, with what she could only describe as careful attention. The night stretched on, cold and merciless, but Clara found herself less afraid with each passing mile, comforted in a strange and inexplicable way by the presence of the massive predator shadowing her journey. She did not understand why he continued to follow her. Why an animal with every reason to abandon a stranger to the mercy of the storm instead chose to walk beside her through the darkest hours of the night. But she understood, with a certainty that surprised her, that whatever debt or bond had formed in that firelit clearing, it was not yet finished. Dawn arrived slowly over Blackthorn Ridge, the sky shifting from black to a bruised shade of gray, as the storm finally began to loosen its grip on the mountain. Clara had walked through most of the night, her body running on nothing but adrenaline and the strange, steadying comfort of the great wolf's presence at her side. By the time the first weak light broke over the tree line, her legs felt like they belonged to someone else entirely, heavy and distant, and every breath came sharp and shallow in the freezing air. She had lost sight of the wolf twice during the night, each time assuming he had finally returned to his pack, only to catch a glimpse of silver-gray fur weaving between distant trees moments later. He never came close enough to touch, never made any gesture that could be mistaken for friendliness in the way a domesticated animal might. He simply remained present, a silent guardian moving parallel to her path, and Clara had stopped questioning why somewhere around the third hour of walking, too exhausted to do anything but accept the strange gift she had been given. It was the sound of rushing water that first told her she was close to Ravenswood Pass. She had crossed this stream a dozen times during her research trips, and the familiar landmark sent a fresh surge of energy through her tired limbs. She quickened her pace, stumbling now more from relief than exhaustion, and it was in this moment of distraction that her boot caught on a hidden root beneath the snow. She went down hard, her ankle twisting beneath her at an angle that sent a bolt of white-hot pain shooting up her leg. She cried out despite herself, the sound sharp and involuntary in the quiet morning air, and for a long moment she simply lay there in the snow, gasping, waiting for the pain to recede enough for her to think clearly again. When she finally looked up, the great wolf was standing directly over her, close enough now that she could feel the warmth radiating from his massive body. She tensed instinctively, old fears resurfacing, despite everything that had passed between them through the night, but he made no aggressive movement. Instead, he lowered his head and nudged gently at her uninjured shoulder, a gesture so careful and deliberate that Clara found herself blinking back tears that had nothing to do with the pain in her ankle. "I'm all right," she managed, though her voice shook with obvious dishonesty. She tried to push herself upright and immediately regretted it, a fresh wave of pain confirming what she already suspected. Her ankle was likely fractured, or at the very least badly sprained, and the ranger station still waited nearly 2 miles further down the ridge. She assessed her situation with the clinical detachment she had trained herself to maintain during field emergencies, even as panic threatened to creep in at the edges. 2 miles was nothing under normal circumstances. 2 miles on a badly injured ankle, through snow still knee-deep in places, after a night without real sleep, was an entirely different calculation. She thought of her radio, dead for 3 days now, useless in her pack. She thought of the fact that no one at the station expected her arrival on any particular schedule, meaning no search party would be dispatched for at least another day, possibly longer. She looked up at the great wolf, who had settled onto his haunches beside her, watching her with those same intelligent amber eyes that had studied her so carefully back in the ravine. "I don't suppose you know a shortcut," she said, attempting humor to mask the fear creeping into her chest, though her voice cracked halfway through the sentence. The wolf tilted his head, an oddly familiar gesture that reminded her sharply of the way domestic dogs sometimes reacted to unfamiliar sounds. And then, to her utter astonishment, he rose and began walking a slow half-circle around her, before stopping and looking back over his shoulder, clearly waiting. Clara stared at him, disbelief warring with desperate hope. She had read accounts, buried deep in obscure research papers and indigenous oral histories, of wild animals occasionally guiding injured humans toward safety, though she had always assumed such stories were exaggerated or misunderstood. She had never expected to test the theory herself, and certainly never with an alpha wolf as her potential guide. She forced herself upright, using a nearby branch as a makeshift crutch, biting back a cry of pain as weight settled onto her injured ankle. The wolf waited patiently as she found her balance, then began moving forward at a slow, deliberate pace that she realized, with growing wonder, was clearly calibrated to match her hobbling gait rather than his own natural speed. They continued this way for nearly an hour, Clara dragging herself forward one painful step at a time, the great wolf never straying more than a few feet ahead, occasionally pausing to look back and ensure she was still following. The path he chose avoided the deepest snowdrifts, wound around fallen logs rather than over them, and Clara found herself wondering, in her increasingly delirious state, whether the animal beside her somehow understood the exact nature of her injury and was adjusting his guidance accordingly. The pain in her ankle had grown from sharp to a deep throbbing ache that radiated up through her entire leg, and her vision had begun to swim at the edges by the time she finally heard the distant sound of a generator humming somewhere ahead. She nearly wept with relief at the sound, recognizing it immediately as the backup power system at Ravenswood Pass Station, still running despite the storm's damage to the main lines. The wolf stopped abruptly at the edge of the tree line, refusing to move any closer to the small wooden structure visible through the thinning trees. Clara turned back to look at him, understanding intuitively that this was as far as their strange journey together would go. Whatever bond had formed between them through the long night, it was not one that could survive proximity to human settlement, not with an entire pack and 3 vulnerable pups depending on his caution. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with exhaustion and emotion she could not fully name. "I won't forget this." The great wolf held her gaze for one final, lingering moment, and then, without any further sound or gesture, turned and disappeared back into the trees, his silver-gray coat vanishing almost instantly into the shadowed forest. Clara stood alone at the edge of the clearing, staring after him for several long seconds before the ache in her ankle finally forced her attention back to the more immediate task of reaching help. She dragged herself the remaining distance to the station door, collapsing against it with the last of her strength, and it was there that fellow ranger Daniel Ashworth found her 20 minutes later, half frozen and barely conscious, mumbling something about wolves that he initially dismissed as the delirious ramblings of a woman who had nearly died in the storm. It would be weeks before Clara found the words to properly explain what had happened in that ravine, and months before anyone at the research station fully believed her account of a wild alpha wolf guiding an injured stranger safely home. But Clara knew what she had witnessed, knew it with a certainty that no amount of scientific skepticism could shake, and as she lay recovering in the small station infirmary, her ankle wrapped and elevated, she found herself already wondering when, or if, she might see the great silver wolf again. 3 weeks passed before Clara could put any real weight on her ankle again, and every one of those weeks felt unbearably slow. She spent her recovery confined mostly to the small research station at Ravenswood Pass, her leg propped on a stack of worn field journals, her mind replaying the events of that storm-battered night, over and over, until she could recall every detail with startling clarity. She told no one beyond Daniel Ashworth the full story, aware of how it sounded, aware that even seasoned wildlife researchers might raise an eyebrow at tales of an alpha wolf escorting an injured stranger safely out of the wilderness. Daniel, to his credit, had not dismissed her outright. He was a quiet, methodical man in his mid-30s who had worked the ridge for nearly a decade, and though he admitted he had never witnessed anything quite like what Clara described, he did not think it impossible. Wolves, he reminded her, were far more complex and socially intelligent than most people gave them credit for. Stories existed, buried in old trapper journals and indigenous accounts passed down through generations, of wild animals forming unexpected bonds with humans who had shown them unusual kindness. Whether Clara's encounter fit neatly into that tradition or represented something entirely new, he could not say. What worried Daniel more than the story itself was the timing of her original disappearance. The storm that had stranded Clara had also, according to reports filtering in from the nearby town of Millbrook, coincided with a noticeable increase in illegal trapping activity along the eastern boundary of Blackthorn Ridge. Several ranchers had reported missing livestock, and more troubling, a pair of hikers had stumbled across the remains of what appeared to be a large predator, caught and killed in an improperly set trap, its pelt removed before wildlife officials could investigate. The timing placed the incident dangerously close to the same territory where Clara had encountered the wolf pack. Clara felt a cold knot form in her stomach as Daniel relayed this information. She thought immediately of the great silver wolf, of the 3 pups she had warmed against her own body through the worst of the storm, and a fierce, protective anger rose in her chest that surprised her with its intensity. She had spent 2 years studying this ecosystem, with careful scientific detachment, documenting behavior and migration patterns from a respectful distance. This felt different. This felt personal in a way she had not expected, and could not fully explain. As soon as her ankle could bear sustained weight, Clara insisted on returning to the field, over Daniel's mild but persistent objections. She justified the decision publicly, as a continuation of her elk migration research. But privately she knew the truth. She needed to know if the pack had survived the winter. She needed to know if the pups she had saved were still alive, and whether the trapping activity Daniel had described posed any real threat to them. The hike back toward the ravine where she had first found the pups took considerably longer than her usual pace, her ankles still tender enough to demand frequent rest breaks. But the late winter landscape had transformed dramatically since her last visit. Snow still blanketed the higher elevations, but the worst of the storms had passed, leaving behind a crisp, clear world of pine and stone that felt almost peaceful compared to the chaos of that first terrifying night. She found the ravine without much difficulty, the landscape now familiar enough to navigate by memory rather than map. The shallow overhang where she had built her small fire remained exactly as she remembered it, though nature had already begun reclaiming the space, fresh snow smoothing over the scorched earth where her fire had once burned. She stood there for a long moment, overwhelmed by the memory of that night, wondering if she would ever encounter the pack again, or if that strange, singular connection had been a one-time gift, never to be repeated. She was preparing to continue her survey further up the ridge, when a low growl from somewhere behind a cluster of boulders made her freeze in place. Every instinct told her to remain perfectly still, and she did so, scanning the rocks with careful, measured attention, until she spotted the source of the sound. A young wolf, clearly one of the 3 pups from that winter night, though now considerably larger and stronger, stood watching her from a partially concealed position, its posture wary, but not immediately aggressive. Clara felt her breath catch in recognition. The silver-gray coat, with darker charcoal markings along the spine, was unmistakable, matching precisely the coloring she remembered from that firelit night. She lowered herself slowly into a crouch, keeping her movements small and non-threatening, the same careful approach that had somehow worked in her favor once before. "Hey there," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think you remember me, but I remember you." The young wolf's growl faded into uncertain silence, its head tilting in that same oddly familiar gesture she recalled from its father months before. For a long moment, animal and human simply regarded each other across the snow-covered clearing, neither moving, neither backing away. Then, from somewhere deeper in the trees, a second growl sounded, lower and far more commanding than the first, and Clara's pulse quickened, with a mixture of fear and unmistakable hope. The great silver wolf emerged from the tree line moments later, his massive frame exactly as imposing as she remembered, his amber eyes finding hers with what she could have sworn was a flicker of recognition. He moved to stand beside his grown pup, his posture relaxed rather than defensive, and Clara felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes. "You're alive," she breathed, hardly daring to believe the reunion unfolding before her. "All of you made it through the winter." The wolf held her gaze for a long moment, before turning and disappearing back into the trees, his pup following close behind. And though the encounter had lasted barely a minute, Clara understood it as confirmation of something she had hoped for, but never truly expected. Whatever bond had formed that stormy night in the ravine had not been forgotten, not entirely, and the pack she had helped, against every rule of survival and scientific detachment, had survived to see another season. But as she made her way back toward the research station that evening, her relief was tempered by the memory of Daniel's warning about trapping activity along the ridge, and she found herself wondering, with growing unease, how much longer that survival might last, if the threat from human hunters continued unchecked. Clara reported the wolf sighting to Daniel that evening, though she left out the more personal details of the encounter, unsure how to explain the strange recognition she had felt passing between herself and the pack, without sounding as though she had lost her grip on scientific objectivity entirely. Daniel listened carefully, his expression thoughtful, and then shared news of his own that immediately shifted the conversation toward more urgent matters. A rancher named Walter Higgins, who owned a modest spread near the eastern edge of Blackthorn Ridge, had come into the station that afternoon with a report of illegal traps discovered on land bordering the protected wilderness area. Walter was an old-timer who had lived near the ridge his entire life, and he had grown increasingly frustrated over the past several weeks, by the sight of unfamiliar trucks parking near the tree line at odd hours, always gone before he could get close enough to identify the drivers. The traps he described were not the kind used by licensed trappers following state regulations. These were larger, crueler devices, clearly intended for bigger predators, rather than the smaller fur-bearing animals typically targeted in the region. Walter suspected, and Daniel privately agreed, that someone was hunting wolves illegally, likely drawn by the value of pelts from a pack rumored among certain circles to include unusually large and striking specimens. Clara felt her stomach turn cold at the description. The pack she had encountered fit that exact profile, their coloring distinctive enough to have likely attracted attention from anyone who had glimpsed them from a distance. She thought immediately of the great silver alpha, of his grown pup watching her from behind the boulders, and a fierce protectiveness rose in her chest that made it difficult to maintain her composure, while Daniel finished relaying Walter's report. "We need to notify wildlife enforcement," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. "Today, if possible." Daniel nodded, already reaching for the station's radio, though his expression carried the weary caution of someone who had filed similar reports before, without much resulting action. "I'll put in the call, but you know how thin enforcement is spread out here. Could be days before anyone can get a team up to investigate properly." The frustration of that reality settled heavily over Clara as she watched Daniel relay the details to the regional wildlife office, his voice calm and professional despite the urgency of the situation. Days, she knew, could mean the difference between the pack's survival and their destruction. She thought of the small pups she had warmed against her own body months before, now grown enough to be roaming independently near the ravine, vulnerable to exactly the kind of trap Walter had described. That night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Clara found herself staring at the ceiling of her small station quarters, turning over every piece of information she had gathered since her rescue. She thought about the timing of the trapping activity, about the specific area Walter had described, and slowly, a plan began forming in her mind. Reckless perhaps, but driven by an urgency she could not ignore. She approached Daniel again early the next morning, finding him already awake and reviewing topographic maps of the eastern ridge. "I want to go out and document the trap locations myself," she said, before he could object. "If we can get photographic evidence and precise coordinates, it strengthens the case for immediate enforcement action, rather than waiting for a routine patrol." Daniel studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks against the potential benefit. "That's not exactly standard research protocol," he said carefully. "And if whoever's setting these traps is out there while you're documenting them, that's a genuinely dangerous situation. Illegal trappers don't take kindly to being photographed." "I'll be careful," Clara promised, though even she recognized the thinness of that assurance given everything that had already happened to her on this ridge. But Walter's traps could kill that pack before enforcement ever makes it up here. "I can't just wait around and hope for the best." After considerable back and forth, Daniel reluctantly agreed to accompany her, insisting they travel together, rather than risk her heading into potentially hostile territory alone. They set out just after dawn, following the coordinates Walter had provided, moving carefully through terrain that grew increasingly unfamiliar as they approached the boundary between protected wilderness and the sprawling private land beyond. It took nearly 3 hours of careful searching before they found the first trap, a large steel device concealed beneath a layer of loose branches near a well-worn game trail. Clara photographed it from multiple angles, her hands steady despite the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior, while Daniel recorded precise GPS coordinates for the enforcement report. They found 2 more traps over the following hour, each positioned with clear intention along paths that predator tracking would suggest were regularly used by the local wolf population. It was as they approached what appeared to be a 4th trap site that Clara heard the unmistakable sound of an engine somewhere down the slope, followed by voices carrying faintly on the morning air. She and Daniel exchanged a quick, tense glance before moving off the main trail, taking cover behind a cluster of dense underbrush as the voices grew steadily closer. 2 men emerged into view moments later, moving with the confident, unhurried gait of people who believed themselves entirely alone on this stretch of the mountain. The taller of the 2 carried a rifle slung casually over one shoulder, while the other dragged a length of chain that Clara recognized immediately as trap-setting equipment. Their conversation, carried on the still morning air, confirmed exactly what Walter had suspected. They were hunting wolves deliberately, discussing pelt prices with a casual cruelty that made Clara's blood run cold. She glanced at Daniel, who gave a small, sharp shake of his head, clearly signaling caution over confrontation. Clara understood the wisdom in his restraint, even as every instinct screamed at her to intervene, to somehow warn the pack, to do something more than simply document evidence from a hidden position in the brush. But she also understood, with the clear-headed calculation that had kept her alive through worse situations, that revealing themselves now would accomplish nothing beyond putting both her and Daniel in immediate danger. They remained hidden until the two men moved on, their voices fading into the distance, before finally emerging from the underbrush with a combined report that would, they hoped, finally push wildlife enforcement into swift and decisive action. But as they made their way back toward the station, Clara could not shake the growing sense that whatever timeline enforcement operated on, the threat facing the pack was moving considerably faster. The report Clara and Daniel filed that afternoon finally produced results, though not quickly enough to entirely ease Clara's mounting anxiety. Wildlife enforcement confirmed a team would be dispatched within 48 hours to remove the illegal traps and investigate the two men Clara and Daniel had observed, but 48 hours felt like an impossibly long window, given what was at stake. Clara spent that evening pacing the small confines of the station, her mind returning again and again to the image of the great silver wolf and his family, somewhere out on the ridge, unaware of the danger closing in around their territory. She made the decision that night, quietly and without consulting Daniel, to return to the ravine one final time before enforcement arrived. She told herself it was simply another research observation, a routine check on pack behavior that fit neatly within her ongoing study, but she knew, deep down, that her real motivation had little to do with scientific documentation. She needed to see them again. She needed some reassurance, however irrational, that they were still safe. She set out before dawn, moving quickly and quietly through terrain, now familiar enough to navigate with confidence despite the dim light. The morning air carried a sharpness that suggested one final cold snap before the true thaw of spring finally arrived, and Clara pulled her jacket tighter as she made her way toward the ravine, her breath fogging in pale clouds ahead of her. She heard the pack before she saw them, a chorus of distant howls rolling across the ridge in a pattern she had come to recognize as a call to gather, rather than a warning of danger. She followed the sound, moving carefully through the trees, and emerged at the edge of a small clearing to find the entire pack assembled in the pale morning light, the great silver alpha standing at their center with unmistakable authority. Clara remained hidden at the tree line, unwilling to disturb what appeared to be some kind of pack gathering, watching as the wolves moved through behaviors she recognized from years of research but had never observed with such vivid, close proximity. The three pups she had once cradled against her own body were now nearly grown, their frames lean and powerful, their movements carrying the confident grace of young adults finding their place within the pack hierarchy. It was the sudden sharp crack of a distant gunshot that shattered the peaceful scene entirely. The pack scattered instantly, wolves bolting in every direction with the practiced efficiency of animals who had faced this exact threat before. Clara's heart lurched painfully as she watched the great alpha herd his family toward the deeper cover of the forest, his massive frame positioned protectively at the rear of the fleeing group, clearly prioritizing their escape over his own safety. A second shot rang out, closer this time, and Clara pressed herself flat against a nearby boulder, her mind racing through the implications of what she was witnessing. The illegal trappers had apparently escalated from setting traps to active hunting, and the timeline she had hoped would hold for 48 hours had clearly collapsed entirely. She caught a glimpse of movement through the trees, two figures moving with purposeful speed along the ridgeline, rifles raised, clearly tracking the fleeing pack with practiced precision. Clara's hands shook as she pulled out her phone, praying for enough signal to reach the station, knowing even as she dialed that help would take far too long to arrive in time to prevent whatever was about to happen. Daniel picked up on the second ring, his voice sharp with immediate concern at the panic evident in Clara's whispered explanation. "Stay hidden," he ordered firmly. "Do not approach them. I'm calling enforcement now, and heading up myself. But Clara, listen to me. Do not put yourself between armed men and that pack." Clara acknowledged the instruction, though even as she did so, she knew she could not simply remain hidden while the pack she had come to care for so deeply ran for their lives through the forest below. She moved carefully along the tree line, staying low, following the sound of distant shouting and the occasional sharp report of gunfire, driven by an impulse she could not fully justify, but also could not resist. She found a vantage point on a rocky outcropping that gave her a clear view of the chase unfolding below. The pack had scattered into smaller groups, a defensive tactic she recognized from her research, splitting the hunter's attention and reducing the chance of the entire family being caught together. But she could see the great alpha still moving with his 3 grown pups, clearly reluctant to abandon them even as the tactic put him at greater risk himself. The 2 hunters had focused their pursuit on exactly this group, drawn perhaps by the alpha's larger size and more valuable pelt, and Clara watched with mounting horror as they closed the distance, moving with the confident, unhurried pace of men who believed victory was already secured. She had no weapon, no way to physically intervene, nothing beyond her own voice, and whatever desperate courage she could summon in this moment. But desperate courage, she decided in a split second, that would haunt and define the rest of this encounter, was going to have to be enough. Clara scrambled down from the outcropping, moving as fast as her still tender ankle would allow, calculating a path that would put her between the approaching hunters and the fleeing pack, without placing her directly in the line of fire. Her mind raced through every option available to her, none of them particularly good, but the image of the great silver alpha sacrificing his own safety to protect his grown pups pushed her forward with a determination that overrode every instinct toward self-preservation. She emerged onto the trail perhaps 100 feet ahead of the 2 hunters, standing in plain view with her arms raised, her voice carrying loud and clear across the cold morning air. "Stop. This is protected wilderness. Wildlife enforcement is already on their way, and I have your descriptions on record." The taller hunter froze mid-stride, clearly startled by her sudden appearance, while his companion raised his rifle instinctively, before lowering it just as quickly upon recognizing her as human rather than animal. "You need to leave," the taller man called back, his voice carrying a warning edge that made Clara's pulse quicken with fresh fear. "This isn't your business." "It's exactly my business," Clara replied, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the tremor she could feel building in her hands. "Illegal hunting on protected land is a federal offense, and I've already documented your traps along with photographs from 3 days ago. Enforcement has your descriptions and your vehicle. Whatever you do here today, they will find you." She had no way of knowing whether this bluff would hold, whether these men would simply push past her threat and continue their pursuit regardless of consequences, but she watched with cautious hope as the 2 men exchanged a tense, calculating glance. The mention of documented evidence and enforcement clearly rattled something in their confidence, and after a long, agonizing moment, the taller hunter lowered his rifle fully. "This isn't over," he muttered, though his tone had shifted from aggressive certainty to something closer to frustrated retreat. The 2 men began backing away, casting wary glances toward the trees where the pack had disappeared, before finally turning and moving quickly back the way they had come, clearly unwilling to risk the legal consequences Clara had described. Clara remained standing on the trail, long after the sound of their retreat had faded entirely, her legs finally giving way beneath the sudden release of adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation. She sank down onto a nearby rock, her breath coming in ragged gasps, hardly able to believe the gamble had actually worked. It was several minutes before she became aware of movement at the tree line, and she looked up to find the great silver alpha standing at the edge of the forest, watching her, with an expression she could have sworn carried something beyond simple animal awareness. His 3 grown pups stood behind him, their postures still tense with the aftermath of the chase, but alive, unharmed, safe. "You're okay," Clara breathed, relief washing through her so completely that tears began streaming down her face before she could stop them. "You're all okay." The great wolf held her gaze for a long moment, and then, in a gesture that would remain etched in Clara's memory for the rest of her life, he stepped forward out of the tree line, closer than he had ever come before, close enough that she could see her own reflection in his intelligent amber eyes. He lowered his head slightly, a gesture that felt unmistakably like acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude, before turning and disappearing back into the forest with his pups following close behind. Clara remained on that rock for a long while after they had gone, processing the full weight of everything that had happened, both in this moment and across the months since that first storm-battered night in the ravine. She thought about the strange, improbable chain of events that had led her here. From a single desperate decision, to share her last meal with 3 dying pups, to standing between armed hunters and their fully grown offspring, risking her own safety for creatures that owed her nothing beyond the accident of her own compassion. Daniel found her there 20 minutes later, having raced up the trail after her phone call, his relief at finding her unharmed, quickly giving way to stern disbelief as she recounted exactly what had transpired in his absence. "You confronted armed hunters alone," he said, shaking his head slowly. "Clara, that could have gone very differently." "I know," she admitted quietly, "but it didn't, and they're safe." Wildlife enforcement arrived at the station later that afternoon, finally prepared to take decisive action based on the evidence Clara and Daniel had gathered. The 2 hunters were identified within days through vehicle registration matched to descriptions provided, facing serious charges that would result in significant fines and a permanent ban from hunting on any protected land in the state. The traps were removed entirely from the eastern ridge, and for the first time in months, Clara allowed herself to believe that the pack might finally have some real measure of safety. Spring arrived on Blackthorn Ridge, with the slow, deliberate patience of a mountain ecosystem, shaking off winter's grip, one careful day at a time. The snow retreated first from the lower elevations, revealing patches of dark earth and the first stubborn shoots of new growth, while the higher peaks held onto their white caps well into the warmer months. Clara spent these weeks fully immersed in her research once again, though her work now carried a personal dimension that had never existed before that fateful storm months earlier. She continued documenting the pack's movements whenever her research schedule allowed, always maintaining a respectful distance, always careful not to interfere with their natural behavior beyond what her role as a careful observer required. She had learned, through hard experience, the delicate balance between compassion and the responsibility to let wild creatures remain wild, and she held to that balance with renewed discipline, even as her fondness for this particular pack grew with each passing week. The 3 pups she had once cradled against her own body had grown into confident young adults, each developing distinct personalities that Clara noted carefully in her field journal, alongside her more formal research observations. The smallest of the 3, the one who had first taken food from her palm on that desperate night, remained noticeably bolder than her siblings, often the first to investigate unfamiliar sounds or approach the boundary of Clara's careful observation distance with evident curiosity rather than fear. Walter Higgins, the rancher whose report had first alerted the station to the illegal trapping activity, became something of an unexpected ally in Clara's ongoing efforts to protect the pack. He had lived alongside wolves his entire life, holding the complicated mixture of respect and wariness common among ranchers who understood both the ecological value and the practical challenges these predators represented. But he had been genuinely disturbed by the cruelty of the traps discovered on his land, and he began quietly monitoring the eastern boundary himself, alerting the station to any further suspicious activity. It was Walter, in fact, who first told Clara the story that would eventually give the great Silver Alpha his lasting reputation among the small community surrounding Blackthorn Ridge. According to Walter, older residents had spoken for years of an unusually large and intelligent wolf leading a pack through this territory, an animal some had taken to calling the mountain's quiet king, not out of fear, but out of a grudging admiration for the strategic caution and evident intelligence he displayed in avoiding conflict with human settlements while still protecting his territory fiercely from other threats. Clara found herself smiling the first time she heard this local nickname, thinking of the great wolf's amber eyes, studying her so carefully in the firelight of that first encounter, of his patient escort through the storm, despite every instinct that should have told him to abandon a vulnerable stranger to her fate. Quiet King felt like an apt description for an animal who had shown restraint, and even something resembling mercy, in circumstances where aggression would have been the far simpler, more expected response. As the months passed, Clara's research began attracting attention beyond the immediate confines of the Ravenswood station. Her careful documentation of the pack's behavior, combined with the dramatic circumstances of her original rescue, caught the interest of a small conservation journal, seeking stories that illustrated the complex, sometimes surprising relationships possible between humans and wild predators, when approached with patience and respect, rather than fear or exploitation. Clara agreed to share her account, though she insisted on framing it carefully within the broader context of legitimate wildlife research, rather than sensationalizing the more personal aspects of her connection to the pack. She wanted readers to understand the real lesson embedded in her experience, that compassion and scientific rigor were not mutually exclusive, that a single act of kindness toward vulnerable creatures could ripple outward in ways no one could have predicted, ultimately contributing to stronger protections for an entire ecosystem. The published account brought renewed attention to the ongoing threat of illegal trapping and hunting across similar wilderness areas throughout the region, prompting several state agencies to review and strengthen enforcement protocols. Clara found a quiet satisfaction in this outcome, understanding that the protection now extended to countless wolves beyond just the single pack she had grown so attached to, a broader legacy emerging from what had begun as a simple, desperate decision to share her last meal on a stormy night. Daniel, watching Clara's research and advocacy work expand over these months, often teased her gently about how far she had come from the strict scientific detachment she had once insisted was essential to proper wildlife study. Clara never fully disagreed with his observations, understanding that her experience with the pack had genuinely changed something fundamental in how she approached her work, though she remained firm that this evolution had only made her research stronger rather than compromising its integrity. It was on a warm afternoon in late spring, nearly a full year after that first desperate encounter in the ravine, that Clara experienced what she would later describe as the most meaningful moment of her entire career. She had hiked out to a familiar overlook to document seasonal migration patterns when she spotted the pack moving through the valley below, the great silver alpha leading his family with the same confident authority she remembered from that very first night. But this time, something was different. As the pack moved along the valley floor, several younger wolves broke away from the main group, revealing 3 additional smaller shapes trailing behind them, unmistakably pups born this same season. Clara watched with growing wonder as the pack paused briefly at the edge of the tree line, and the great alpha lifted his head, his gaze finding hers across the considerable distance with an accuracy that felt far too precise to be coincidental. He held her gaze for a long moment before turning and continuing on with his family, but in that brief exchange, Clara felt something settle deeply within her chest, a profound sense of completion that went beyond simple scientific satisfaction. The pack had not just survived the dangers of the past year, they had thrived, grown, expanded, carrying forward the legacy of that single desperate night when a starving stranger had chosen compassion over self-preservation. 2 years after that first storm-battered night in the ravine, Clara Whitfield stood once again on the familiar overlook above Blackthorn Ridge, though the young researcher who had stumbled through that blizzard bore little resemblance to the confident wildlife specialist she had since become. Her research on the pack had grown into one of the most comprehensive long-term studies of wolf pack dynamics conducted in the region, drawing interest from universities and conservation organizations eager to understand the delicate balance between predator populations and the human communities sharing their territory. She had moved into a small cabin near the eastern boundary of the ridge, close enough to continue her daily observations without the long commute from the main station, and close enough, if she was honest with herself, to remain near the pack that had so fundamentally reshaped the course of her life and career. Daniel visited often, their friendship having deepened over the years into something Clara valued as much as any professional achievement, and Walter Higgins had become something of an unofficial guardian of the eastern boundary, his ranch now serving as an informal buffer zone that discouraged further illegal activity along the wolves' territory. The pack itself had grown considerably since that first desperate winter, expanding to include multiple litters born across successive seasons, though Clara maintained careful boundaries in her observations, never allowing her personal fondness to compromise the scientific integrity of her work. She documented their movements, their hunting patterns, their complex social hierarchies, with the same rigorous discipline she had always brought to her research, even as a quiet, private part of her heart remained forever changed by the memory of 3 dying pups warming against her chest in a snow-covered ravine. The great silver alpha, now bearing the weight of advancing years in the slight gray that had spread further through his already pale coat, remained the undisputed leader of his pack, though Clara had begun noticing subtle signs that leadership would eventually pass to one of his now fully grown offspring. She found herself thinking often about legacy during these observations, about how a single choice made in a moment of desperate compassion had rippled outward across years, protecting not just 3 vulnerable pups but an entire expanding family. And through her published research and advocacy, contributing to stronger protections for wolf populations across the broader region. Local legend around Ravenswood and the surrounding communities had only grown more elaborate in the retelling. The story of the mountain's quiet king, and the woman who had shared her last meal with his lost pups becoming something of a beloved regional tale, told to visiting hikers and curious researchers alike. Clara had grown comfortable with this local mythology, understanding that stories, even embellished ones, often carried important truths about the value of compassion and the surprising bonds possible between humans and the wild world around them. On this particular afternoon, as the late summer sun cast long shadows across the valley below, Clara watched the pack move through their territory with the easy confidence of a family long established and secure in their environment. She thought back to that first terrifying night, to the fear and desperation that had driven her to share the last of her food with 3 dying strangers, never imagining the extraordinary chain of events that single choice would set into motion. She thought about how close she had come to walking away that night, how easily fear and self-preservation could have overridden the quieter instinct toward compassion, and how different everything might have turned out had she made a different choice in that critical moment. But she had chosen kindness, even at genuine cost to herself, and that choice had returned to her many times over, in ways she could never have predicted or planned. As if sensing her presence, though the distance remained too great for any true detection, the great silver alpha paused at the edge of the tree line and turned his head toward the overlook where Clara stood. She could not truly see his eyes from this distance, could not know for certain whether recognition passed between them the way it always seemed to during their rare direct encounters, but she liked to believe, in the quiet, private space of her own heart, that some understanding remained between them still, a bond forged in desperation and sustained through years of mutual respect and careful distance. She raised her hand in a small, simple gesture of acknowledgement, though she knew he could not possibly see such a small motion from this distance, and then she turned back to her field journal, recording her observations with the same careful discipline that had defined her research from the very beginning. But as she wrote, she allowed herself one small personal note at the bottom of the page, a reminder to herself of the lesson this entire extraordinary journey had taught her. Compassion, she wrote, costs something in the moment it is given, but its returns unfold across a lifetime, in ways no one can fully predict or measure. She closed her journal and began the walk back toward her cabin, the pack continuing their evening movements in the valley below, secure in their territory, protected by the careful advocacy her research had helped establish, thriving in a way that felt, to Clara, like the truest and most meaningful measure of everything that single desperate choice on a stormy winter night had ultimately made possible. The story of the woman who shared her last meal with 3 lost wolf pups, unaware their father was the mountain's quiet king, would be told for years to come around Ravenswood Pass, not simply as an entertaining tale of an unlikely bond between human and beast, but as a quiet testament to the profound and often unexpected ways that a single act of kindness, offered without any expectation of return, can transform not just one life, but many, echoing forward across seasons and years, in ways the giver could never have imagined possible.